At the end of the 2nd century AD, the Roman Empire was no longer the secure and silently dominant organism that had governed the Mediterranean world under Antoninus Pius. Borders speak, and they do so with the language of war. 179 AD opens as a year that does not promise definitive solutions, but demands clarity, resistance, and memory. It is a year that lives on the immediate legacy of what preceded it: decisions already made, men already tested, armies already worn out. To really understand what happens in 179, we need to go back just 1 year and observe the state of things not as a distant preamble, but as a still open wound. The Marcomannic Wars are not a sequence of isolated campaigns. They are a single, long friction between Rome and a barbaric world that has learned to strike, retreat, and survive. 178 AD did not end with peace, but with an armed suspension, a truce imposed by the season, by fatigue and by the need to reorganize forces that could no longer be wasted. The previous year had seen the empire engaged in constant pressure along the Danube front, a front that was not a clear line but an unstable contact zone, made up of rivers, forests, floodplains, and passes that were difficult to control. The Germanic populations, in particular Marcomanni and Quadi, had suffered hard, but not decisive, blows. Roman punitive expeditions had devastated villages, captured prisoners, imposed forced negotiations, but had not destroyed the tribe's ability to resist. Indeed, the harshness of the operations had contributed to radicalizing a part of the barbarian world, pushing different groups to coordinate, if not in a true stable alliance, at least in a temporary convergence of interests. From the Roman point of view, 178 was a year of controlled advance, but also of awareness. The idea of a rapid normalization of the border was definitively over. The legions, already reduced in number by the losses of previous years and by the Great Plague that had struck the empire starting from the previous decade, had fought without the safety margin of the past. The units had been integrated with new, often hasty, recruits and with auxiliary contingents recruited precisely in the border regions. This had guaranteed sufficient numbers, but at the price of less homogeneity and a discipline that had to be constantly reaffirmed. At the end of 178, many units were tired, not only physically, but mentally, a war that did not know major decisive battles, but a succession of marches, minor clashes, ambushes and long stays in hostile territories, wears out more than a pitched battle. Marcus Aurelius, who had spent most of the previous years on the Danube front, knew well that the empire was playing a game of resistance rather than conquest. In 178 he had confirmed a prudent strategic line: advance when possible, strike hard when the opportunity arose, but avoid exposing oneself to unnecessary risks. It was not the prudence of a hesitant commander, but that of someone who understands that a serious defeat, in those conditions, could have irreparable consequences. The empire no longer had infinite reserves. Each legion lost was a wound that took years to heal. On the barbarian side, the situation was equally complex. The tribes involved in the conflict were not standing armies, but armed communities, capable of fighting only for limited periods. 178 had seen many warriors return to their lands with modest spoils and significant losses. The devastated camps and the deported or dispersed populations had created internal pressure that made it difficult to sustain a prolonged war. However, the awareness of having resisted the Roman attack, of not having been annihilated, fueled a form of collective trust. Rome was not invincible, and this, for those who lived beyond the Danube, was a new and powerful fact. At the end of the year, the front line had not collapsed, but not pacified either. Advanced Roman outposts had been maintained, but often isolated, linked by military roads that had to be continuously patrolled. Each garrison was a statement of control, but also a potential target. Security depended on the ability to react quickly, to concentrate forces in case of emergency, to prevent rather than pursue. This precarious balance was the true legacy of 178 to 179, a system that worked, but only if maintained with constant attention. Morale, both Roman and barbaric, was ambiguous. In Rome we could speak of successful resistance, of borders held, of a present and active emperor. But we also knew that the war was not ending. Among the tribes, tiredness coexisted with the pride of having forced the empire to commit with all its strength. Neither side had gotten what they really wanted. And it is precisely this absence of a clear conclusion that defines the legacy of 178, a conflict that drags on because no one can afford to lose it, but no one manages to win it definitively. When 179 AD opens, it does so against this background. Legions camped in difficult territories, commanders who know the value of time and caution, barbarian populations who have learned to measure Roman strength without blindly fearing it anymore. Nothing started from scratch. Everything that will happen in the new year is already, to some extent, contained in what has been left pending. In this silent continuity, made up of armed expectations and thoughtful decisions, lies the true starting point of 179 AD, a year that inherits from the previous one not a fragile peace, but a war that has learned to last. During 179 AD, the presence of Marcus Aurelius on the Danube front was not a symbolic element nor a simple act of imperial propaganda, but a structural component of the conduct of the war. The emperor does not govern a conflict delegated to his generals from afar. He lives in it, follows it day by day, takes on its material and moral weight. The sources agree in placing him permanently in the area of operations, probably between Upper Pannonia and Lower Pannonia, in a network of mobile headquarters that allow him to maintain control over a vast and fragmented front. Marcus Aurelius is now a man tested by age, illness, and years of campaigning, but his authority derives precisely from this continuous exposure. The soldiers see him, meet him, know that he shares the same harsh conditions of a war fought far from the cities, in cold and hostile territories, where logistics are always on the verge of breaking down. In 179, the emperor acted above all as supreme coordinator, rather than as tactical commander. He does not lead charges nor expose himself directly to conflict, but decides times, priorities, and strategic directions. Its main task is to maintain the coherence of Roman action, preventing individual local victories from turning into broader vulnerabilities. In a conflict made up of many minor operations, Marcus Aurelius imposes an overall vision that takes into account the seasons, the available resources, and the need not to exasperate an army already subjected to great stress. The War of 179 was not a war of coups, but of progressive control, and the emperor was the political and military guarantor. The relationship with the generals is marked by vigilant trust. Marcus Aurelius is not a centralizing emperor in the impulsive sense of the term, but neither is he a distant ruler. He knows his commanders, evaluates their capabilities, corrects their excesses. In particular, it favors officers experienced in border warfare, men accustomed to operating independently without losing contact with central command. His correspondence, although only indirectly reconstructible, suggests a style of government based on persuasion rather than dry order, on empowerment rather than punishment. This does not mean weakness. Discipline remains ironclad, but is supported by a shared awareness of the gravity of the situation. The emperor's life in 179 took place almost entirely within the military perimeter. The sources allude to an existence marked by war councils, hearings with commanders, reading reports, moments of writing and personal reflection. It is in these months that Marcus Aurelius continues, or perhaps resumes, the exercise of writing down thoughts intended for himself, reflections that tradition has preserved as the expression of a philosophy lived rather than proclaimed. This is not an escape from reality, but a way to bear the weight of decisions that lead to death, devastation, and suffering. His stoic acceptance of duty does not lessen the harshness of war, but makes it, for him, bearable. From an operational point of view, Marcus Aurelius intervenes above all in defining priorities. In 179, he does not seek a decisive battle that could put an end to the conflict in a single blow. The experience of previous years has shown how illusory such ambitions are against an enemy that does not defend monumental cities or political capitals. The objective is rather to prevent new major incursions into Roman territory, maintain pressure beyond the Danube, and force the tribes to disperse their forces. This strategy requires patience and a constant presence of the supreme command, capable of resisting the temptation to proclaim a premature victory. The emperor also plays an essential function in maintaining the morale of the army. His figure embodies the idea that war is not a marginal affair, but a vital issue for the empire. In moments of difficulty, his physical presence in the camps has a value that no proclamation could replace. The anecdotes handed down, although filtered by rhetoric, insist on a sober, accessible emperor, capable of listening, but inflexible when it comes to order and discipline. This balance helps to strengthen the cohesion of an army now made up of men of very different origins, united more by the practice of war than by a common identity. In 179, Marcus Aurelius also had to manage the relationship between military needs and imperial administration. Every decision made on the front has fiscal, logistical, and political repercussions. Maintaining large forces along the Danube implies a continuous flow of supplies involving distant provinces, from Italy to Africa. The emperor is aware that a too long war risks weakening the entire imperial system, but he also knows that a hasty peace, if perceived as a sign of weakness, could be even more dangerous. This tension runs through his entire work throughout the year. 179 is therefore not the year of great imperial proclamations, but that of careful and almost silent management of power. Marcus Aurelius appears as a central figure not for sensational gestures, but for the continuity of his presence and his line of conduct. The Marcomannic War, in this phase, reflects the character of its emperor: severe, rational, without illusions. Every day spent on the front is as much an act of resistance as every armed clash. And while the legions move, take up positions and prepare for new operations, the emperor remains there, not as an epic hero seeking glory, but as the guardian of a fragile balance, aware that the real enemy is not only beyond the Danube, but also time which consumes men, resources, and certainties. In 179 AD, the war along the Danube took the concrete form of movements, rather than that of decisive battles. It is a war made of calculated marches, of monitored river crossings, of columns that advance and stop according to a rhythm imposed not only by the enemy, but by the territory itself. The Roman legions do not move in a vacuum. Each movement is a choice that takes into account the available supplies, the practicable roads, the seasons, and the need to keep the lines of communication open. At the beginning of the year, the disposition of the Roman forces reflects the containment strategy developed in the previous months. The main concentrations remain in the Pannonian provinces, with units deployed in depth rather than rigidly deployed along the river. The Danube continues to be the backbone of the defense system, but no longer a static barrier. It is a route of movement, a logistical axis, a border that can be overcome and restored depending on operational needs. The Roman movements during 179 are characterized by constant attention to the prevention of incursions. The legions and auxiliaries made limited advances across the river, penetrating barbarian territory with the aim of disturbing enemy groups, destroying resources, and forcing the tribes to disperse. These operations do not aim at the stable conquest of large areas, but at preventing the formation of large armed masses capable of threatening the limes. Each Roman column is accompanied by reconnaissance departments, often made up of local auxiliaries, more suited to moving in wooded environments and interpreting local signals. Caution is a necessity, not a convenient choice. Ambushes remain one of the enemy's main weapons, and the memory of previous disasters is never far away. On the barbarian side, the movements are more difficult to reconstruct precisely, but some coherent lines of behavior still emerge. The tribes involved avoid, as far as possible, a head-on clash with large Roman forces. They prefer to move quickly, exploit terrain knowledge, and strike isolated targets. In 179 we did not witness a large coordinated invasion as in previous years, but a series of disruptive maneuvers aimed at wearing down the adversary and testing the strength of the defensive system. Barbarian movements often followed the edges of Roman control, seeking out points where surveillance was less dense or where the distance between garrisons created room for maneuver. Terrain plays a decisive role in this phase of the conflict. The dense forests, marshy areas, and minor waterways make the use of traditional formations difficult and force the Roman army into operational flexibility that is not always easy to achieve. The marches are slow, the columns long, and every stop can turn into a moment of vulnerability. For this reason, in 179 there was a growing attention to the safety of movements. Fortified camps quickly set up, strengthened guard shifts, rigorous control of the rear areas. War is not fought only when weapons clash, but in every hour spent in hostile territory. The Danube itself, which in the past had represented a relatively stable line, in 179 became a dynamic element. Crossings are planned with extreme care, often in multiple points at the same time, to confuse the enemy and reduce the risk of hostile concentrations. River fleets play an essential role, transporting troops, supplies, and information. Control of the river allows the Romans to react quickly to sudden threats, but requires continuous surveillance and considerable resources. Every stretch not patrolled represents a potential flaw in the system. The movements of the Roman army in 179 are not always spectacular, but they are constant. The legions move to reinforce sectors considered at risk, to support advanced outposts, or to exploit information on temporary enemy concentrations. This continuous reshuffling of forces helps to maintain the strategic initiative, even in the absence of major victories. From the soldier's point of view, however, it means incessant fatigue, repeated marches, building and dismantling camps, adapting to often adverse climatic conditions. The War of 179 is a war of physical resistance even before tactical skill. Even enemy movements were affected by Roman pressure. Tribes are forced to move with families and possessions, to hide resources, to avoid the most exposed areas. This generates forced mobility that weakens internal cohesion and makes it difficult to sustain prolonged operations. However, dispersion does not equate to defeat. On the contrary, it makes the enemy more elusive and prolongs the conflict. The Romans must chase an opponent who rarely accepts the conditions of the clash, and this requires constant commitment and a remarkable ability to adapt. Overall, 179 AD sees a war that moves more in space than in time. There are no sudden turning points, but a series of continuous adjustments, of measured advances and retreats. Every movement is the result of careful evaluation, every stop a deliberate choice. In this tangle of marches, rivers, and forests, the Roman Empire still demonstrates its ability to organize and support complex large-scale operations, but it also reveals the limits of a system that must deal with an enemy that has learned to never offer the terrain of final decision. 179 is not the year in which the war is decided, but the one in which it is understood, with ever greater clarity, that victory, if it comes, will not be the fruit of a single movement, but of the patient accumulation of many steps taken in the silence of the woods and along the dark waters of the Danube. In 179 AD, the Roman presence beyond and along the Danube was not only measured in the movements of the legions or in armed clashes, but above all in the network of outposts that mark the territory and redefine its control. These garrisons are not simple static points on a map. They are instruments of domination, visible signs of an imperial will that intends to transform an unstable space into a monitored, if not yet pacified, area. Over the course of the year, Roma consolidated a strategy that favors defensive depth over the rigidity of the border, multiplying the support points and creating a shirt capable of absorbing sudden impacts and reacting quickly. The outposts are located in carefully chosen places: communication nodes, river fords, hills overlooking transit routes, edges of forests from which incursions could launch. Each garrison is the result of a strategic evaluation that takes into account the terrain, distances, and the possibility of being resupplied and reinforced. In 179, we did not witness a massive foundation of new monumental fortresses, but a refinement of the existing system. The Romans strengthened existing structures, transformed temporary camps into more stable garrisons, improved the defenses of outposts that had proven vulnerable in previous years. More robust palisades, deepened ditches, better positioned observation towers are concrete interventions that respond to the experience accumulated in the field. The goal is not to make each outpost impregnable, but sufficiently resistant to gain time in the event of an attack, allowing the arrival of reinforcements or the concentration of mobile forces. In this sense, the primary function of the garrisons is not to fight to the last man, but to signal, slow down, control. The distribution of outposts in 179 reflects Rome's desire to maintain the initiative even in the absence of major offensives. They serve as bases for continuous patrols, as assembly points for moving columns, and as safe places to stockpile supplies. Their presence forces the barbarian tribes to modify their movements, to avoid certain areas, to disperse their forces. Each Roman garrison, even if numerically limited, exerts significant psychological pressure. It represents a constant eye, a latent threat, an obstacle to freedom of movement. In a conflict of attrition, this fragmented but persistent control is one of the empire's most effective weapons. Life in the outposts is harsh and devoid of any heroic rhetoric. Garrisons are often made up of mixed units, legions flanked by auxiliaries of different origins, called to live together in confined spaces for long periods. The days are marked by guard shifts, maintenance work, exercises, and patrols. The enemy is not always visible, but he is always present as a possibility. This state of permanent alert wears out soldiers as much as an active campaign. In 179, however, discipline remains solid. The experience accumulated in previous years has taught the importance of routine and order as survival tools. Every repeated gesture, every respected procedure, is a form of defense against the unexpected. The outposts also perform an intelligence-gathering function. Explorers, messengers, and interpreters leave from them in order to maintain contact with local populations or observe enemy movements. In 179, Roman intelligence was not a centralized system in the modern sense of the term, but a network of fragmented observations which, once collected and interpreted, allowed the command to anticipate threats or exploit opportunities. The outposts are the nodes of this network, places where news takes shape and becomes operational decisions. The ability to react quickly to an incursion or intercept an enemy concentration often depends on the readiness of these peripheral garrisons. From a barbarian point of view, the Roman outposts represent a disturbing and irritating presence. Attacking them head-on is risky and often not very fruitful, but leaving them undisturbed means accepting an increasing limitation of one's freedom. In 179 there were attempts to attack isolated garrisons, not so much to destroy them definitively, but to test their resistance and to inflict losses that could have a moral impact. These attacks, when they occur, are swift and violent, followed by immediate retreats. Even when they don't achieve decisive results, they help keep tension high and remind us that Roman control is always contested. The choice of places in which to establish or maintain outposts in 179 reveals an increasingly refined knowledge of the territory. The Romans learned to read the landscape not only in terms of natural obstacles, but as a system of possibilities. A hill is not just a defensive point, but a place from which to observe and communicate. A minor river is not just a barrier, but a route of access or escape. This ability to adapt is one of the secrets of Roman resilience in the Marcomannic War. Outposts are not foreign bodies imposed from the outside, but structures that communicate with the environment, exploit it and transform it. During 179, the outpost system contributed to giving the empire an advantage that did not immediately translate into victory, but into relative stability. Despite the difficulties, the front did not collapse, large incursions were prevented or contained, and control of the territory, although imperfect, remained in Roman hands. This result is not spectacular, but it is essential. In a war that offers no quick triumphs, the ability to maintain a continuous and organized presence is already a form of success. The outposts, with their silent obstinacy, embody this strategy. Small points of resistance that, put together, support the weight of an empire determined not to retreat. In 179 AD, the war along the Danube was entrusted, in its most concrete and risky dimension, to the ability of the generals to operate away from the direct gaze of the emperor, in spaces where the authority of Rome was measured day by day on the ground. Marcus Aurelius provides the strategic direction and political horizon of the conflict, but it is the commanders in the field who transform intentions into reality, facing uncertainty, isolation, and danger firsthand. Among these, the figure of Marcus Valerius Maximianus emerges with particular clarity, whose action during this phase of the Marcomannic Wars offers a concrete example of the value, courage, and competence that characterized the Roman military elite engaged on the northern front. Maximian is not a general for a great decisive battle, but a commander accustomed to moving in difficult contexts, where success depends on the ability to maintain the cohesion of the troops and make quick decisions in extreme conditions. In 179, when the empire intensifies offensive pressure against the Germanic populations north of the Danube, its role becomes emblematic of a war that is no longer fought only on the border, but deep into enemy territory. The objective is not just to repel or contain, but to demonstrate that Rome is capable of striking everywhere, even far from its consolidated bases. It is in this context that Maximian leads a detachment of the Legio II Adiatrix in one of the most daring operations of the entire conflict. The choice to push into the heart of the Quadi territory, well beyond the limes, was not dictated by a gesture of temerity, but by a precise strategic evaluation, depriving the enemy of the safety of the rear, interrupting his ability to organize himself during the winter season and demonstrating that not even the period traditionally favorable to the barbarians offered protection from the Roman initiative. For a structured army like the Roman one, accustomed to operating close to relatively safe supply lines, such a decision entails enormous risks. The detachment led by Maximian advances to Laugaricio, today's Trenčín, about 120 kilometers north of the Roman border. It is a distance which, in the context of the border war, takes on an extraordinary symbolic and practical value. It means operating in a territory where every supply must be carefully planned, where the possibility of receiving rapid reinforcements is limited and where the enemy knows every path, every valley, every possibility of ambush. Here the Roman soldiers are no longer protected by the network of outposts and military roads that characterizes the imperial defense system, but must rely on their own discipline and the commander's ability to maintain control. Wintering in Laugaricio represents one of the hardest and at the same time most significant moments of the entire campaign. Spending the winter in hostile territory means facing not only the constant risk of sudden attacks, but also the cold, the scarcity of resources, and the psychological fatigue of isolation. In these conditions, Maximian's command translates into a daily test of leadership. Maintaining discipline, organizing the defense of the camp, Ensuring the survival of the men becomes a form of combat as much as armed conflict. Every day passed without disorder or failure is a silent victory. The extraordinary nature of this undertaking is attested by direct and tangible testimony. The rock inscription still visible on the rock wall under the current Trenčín castle. The text, sober and solemn, celebrates the victory of the emperors, dedicated to Marcus Aurelius and Commodus, and remembers Marcus Valerius Maximianus, legate of the Legio II-Adaptation, with his 855 soldiers. This is not a rhetorical celebration as an end in itself, but the recording of a fact that contemporaries consider worthy of permanent memory. Engraving the memory of that operation in the rock means affirming that Rome was there, deep in the barbarian world, and that it remained there long enough to leave a mark that will last. This episode is not an isolated exception, but the most evident manifestation of a command model that characterizes the Roman generals during the Marcomannic Wars. Men like Maximian demonstrate their value not through theatrical gestures, but through their ability to take on enormous responsibilities far from the center of power, trusting in their own experience and the solidity of the troops entrusted to them. The courage that emerges from these actions is not the impulsive one of the frontal assault, but the more difficult one of perseverance, of the decision made knowing that one mistake could mean the destruction of the entire department. For the empire, operations like Laugaricio have a meaning that goes beyond the immediate result. They strengthen the credibility of the Roman presence, demonstrate that military pressure knows no seasons of respite, and contribute to breaking the enemy's confidence in the security of their territories. At the same time, they consolidate the prestige of the commanders in the field and strengthen the bond between them and the emperor, who can count on men capable of translating strategy into concrete action even in the most extreme conditions. In the context of 179 AD, Maximian's action north of the Danube appears as one of the highest moments of a war often made up of dark and exhausting operations. It shows how, during the Marcomannic Wars, the Roman generals were able to demonstrate constant, non-episodic value, facing a war that required more resistance than spectacularity. In these silent undertakings, sometimes engraved in the rock rather than celebrated in the triumphs, the true strength of the Roman army at the end of the 2nd century is reflected, a strength that does not reside only in the power of the legions, but in the quality of the men called to lead them. In 179 AD, the Marcomannic War does not offer the narrative comfort of great pitched battles with a clearly recognizable beginning and end. The clashes that characterize the year are numerous, fragmented, often asymmetrical, and for this reason revealing the profound nature of the conflict. It is not an absence of fighting, but a transformation of it. Violence is continuous, widespread, inserted into the daily fabric of military operations. The sources do not hand down solemn names of battles or triumphal lists of victories, but allow us to reconstruct a coherent sequence of minor clashes, punitive actions, ambushes repelled or suffered, roundup and repression operations which, taken together, define the progress of the year. The clashes of 179 occur mainly in a context of controlled mobility. The Roman columns, engaged in limited advances or in missions to protect the outposts, came into contact several times with Germanic armed groups. These contacts are not casual, but the result of constant pressure exerted by both parties. The Romans try to prevent the recomposition of significant enemy forces. The barbarians try to attack isolated units, supply convoys, peripheral garrisons. Clashes often arise from reconnaissance that degenerate into combat, or from attempts to surprise the enemy during marches or in the encampment phases. From a tactical point of view, the clashes of 179 show the Roman army's remarkable ability to adapt. The legions, flanked by auxiliaries, avoid pursuing the enemy recklessly and favor compact formations, ready to resist sudden blows. Ambushes, a favorite weapon of the Germanic populations, did not disappear, but lost part of their effectiveness thanks to greater attention to the safety of the columns and better knowledge of the terrain. This does not mean that the Romans are immune to losses. Every clash involves deaths and injuries, and the War of Attrition continues to consume men and energy. Punitive actions represent a significant component of the clashes of 179. When the information gathered by the explorers indicates the presence of hostile villages or groups, the Roman forces intervene quickly, destroying settlements, confiscating resources and capturing prisoners. These operations have a dual purpose: to physically strike the enemy and to convey a clear message about Rome's ability to intervene anywhere. From a barbaric perspective, such actions fuel hatred and resistance, but at the same time reduce the ability to sustain large-scale offensive operations. It is a spiral of violence that does not lead to an immediate solution, but which progressively wears down the social structures of the tribes involved. There is no shortage of more intense clashes, when Germanic groups attempt to force the Roman defensive system or react to incursions into territory controlled by the empire. In these cases, the fighting takes on a more decisive character, with the use of greater forces and a longer duration. However, even these episodes do not turn into decisive battles. Barbarians, aware of their inferiority in a prolonged battle, tend to retreat once they realize they cannot gain an immediate advantage. The Romans, for their part, avoided too deep pursuits which could expose them to new ambushes. The result is a series of confrontations that often result in mutual containment, rather than in a complete destruction of one of the two parties. The strategic consequences of these clashes are cumulative rather than immediate. Each battle helps maintain the Roman initiative, preventing the enemy from concentrating forces and planning large-scale incursions. At the same time, the accumulated losses and fatigue make it clear that the empire is paying a high price for this continuous pressure. The human toll of the clashes of 179 is difficult to quantify, but it is certain that they contributed to a progressive attrition of the army, only partially compensated by new recruitments and the integration of auxiliaries. On the barbarian side, the clashes of 179 reinforce a strategy of survival rather than victory. Tribes learn to avoid direct confrontation and exploit every opportunity to inflict casualties without exposing themselves to excessive risk. This attitude does not lead to decisive successes, but prolongs the conflict and forces Rome to maintain a constant and onerous commitment. War thus becomes a competition of resistance, in which each clash is less important for its immediate outcome than for the way in which it contributes to consuming the opponent's resources. When we observe all the clashes of 179, a picture emerges consistent with the advanced phase of the Marcomannic Wars. It is no longer the time of great sudden invasions nor that of desperate Roman responses. It is a phase of maturity of the conflict, in which both sides know well the limits and possibilities of the other. The Romans demonstrate their ability to control the battlefield even in the absence of spectacular triumphs. The barbarians demonstrate that they can resist without being annihilated. The result is a year marked by continuous but contained violence, in which every clash, however small, contributes to defining the unstable balance of the front. 179 AD does not bring to mind a symbolic battle, but a long sequence of battles which, added together, weigh as much as a decisive clash. In this war without dramatic climaxes, the value of soldiers and commanders is measured in their ability to face the ordinary brutality of conflict day after day. The clashes of 179 are concrete proof of a war that does not allow pauses and does not offer quick solutions, but which continues to be fought with determination by both sides, waiting for attrition to slowly produce its effects. In 179 AD, the ability of the Roman Empire to continue the war did not depend only on the outcome of the clashes or the skill of the commanders, but on the overall stability of the military apparatus. It is a year in which the army is not simply employed, it is maintained, adapted, repaired. After more than a decade of conflicts along the Danube, the legions are tired organisms, marked by continuous losses, frequent replacements, and constant psychological pressure. Preparing the army, at this stage, means first of all preventing its collapse. It is not a question of creating a new force, but of maintaining the existing one, strengthening it enough to allow it to continue fighting. During 179, the strengthening of the Roman army took on different and complementary forms. Recruitment remains a permanent necessity. The provinces of the empire continue to supply men, but more and more often they arrive with a cursory initial training and must be trained directly on the front. The experience accumulated by veterans, therefore, becomes an essential resource. The older soldiers are not just fighters, but transmitters of practical knowledge. They teach how to move in wooded areas, how to react to an ambush, how to build a safe camp in a few hours. This transfer of competences is one of the least visible but most important elements of Roman resilience in 179. Alongside recruitment, the weight of auxiliaries is growing. Units coming from different regions of the empire, often more accustomed to forms of irregular warfare, are permanently integrated into the operations. Their presence is no longer accessory, but structural. In 179, the Roman army on the Danube is a mosaic of languages, traditions, and military specializations. This heterogeneity causes problems of coordination and discipline, but it also offers a flexibility that is indispensable. The auxiliary units are used in reconnaissance, patrols, rapid actions, while the legions maintain the role of reference force, capable of sustaining a prolonged clash if necessary. The army's preparation also goes through continuous training, which knows no real breaks even during periods of apparent calm. In 179, each camp becomes an exercise space. The maneuvers are not abstract, but modeled on recent experiences. Simulations of sudden attacks, field defense exercises, coordination between heavy infantry and mobile units. The goal is not to achieve theoretical perfection, but to consolidate automatisms that can function under stress. In a war where clashes often arise suddenly, the ability to react without hesitation is crucial. Discipline remains one of the pillars of the Roman army, but in 179 it takes on a less rigid and more pragmatic form than in the past. Commanders are aware that excessive repression could break already fragile morale. Discipline is then maintained through a delicate balance between firmness and understanding. Punishments exist and are applied when necessary, but we try to avoid measures that could compromise the cohesion of the units. The long war taught that a demoralized army is more dangerous for itself than for the enemy. A crucial aspect of preparation concerns logistics. In 179, ensuring regular supplies of food, weapons, and equipment is a constant challenge. Long supply lines must pass through often insecure regions, and each convoy represents a potential target. For this reason, the army learns to reduce its dependence on the outside when possible, accumulating supplies in outposts and exploiting local resources. This practice, while necessary, has serious consequences for the populations involved and contributes to keeping tension high. However, from the Roman point of view, it is an essential condition for operational survival. The preparation of the army in 179 is also a mental preparation. The soldiers know they are engaged not in a short campaign, but in a war that may not offer a clear conclusion in the short term. This affects how they perceive their role and sacrifice. The commanders, with the support of the emperor, try to make sense of this prolonged effort, underlining the importance of the mission and the need to defend the empire from a threat which, if allowed to grow, could become uncontrollable. The official rhetoric no longer speaks of immediate glory, but of duty and resistance. Over the course of the year, the army demonstrates a remarkable ability to adapt tactically. The accumulated experiences lead to changes in the use of forces, in the layout of the camps, in the management of marches. Unnecessary risks are reduced, safety measures are strengthened, and we learn to recognize the signs of imminent danger. This continuous learning process is one of the factors that allow Rome to maintain control of the situation despite the difficulties. 179 is not a year of revolutionary innovations, but of progressive improvements, which when added together make the difference. The strengthening of the army does not mean that the difficulties disappear. The losses continue, tiredness accumulates, and there is no shortage of episodes of tension and crisis. However, overall, the Roman military apparatus proved to be able to withstand the impact. The combination of recruitment, training, adapted discipline, and logistical management allows the empire to maintain an effective operational force. This result, apparently modest, is actually extraordinary if we consider the duration and intensity of the conflict. At the end of 179, the Roman army was no longer the one that had started the Marcomannic Wars years earlier. It has changed in composition, in tactics, in mentality. It is a more experienced army, but also more aware of its limits. His preparation is not oriented towards a decisive final blow, but towards the ability to continue fighting without collapsing. This organized resistance reflects one of the most profound characteristics of the Roman Empire at the end of the 2nd century. The ability to adapt to a war that does not grant quick glory, but which requires, day after day, a discipline that is renewed through fatigue. 179 AD, closing the cycle of a difficult and strategically complex year, clearly shows how the Marcomannic War was a total test for the empire, not only on a military level, but also on a political, logistical, and moral level. After months of marches, widespread clashes, punitive actions, garrison and strengthening of outposts, and systematic preparation of the army, the year ends without a spectacular victory, but with the consolidation of strategic control that allows Rome to maintain the initiative. This final phase of 179 allows us to observe how each element — men, commanders, resources, disciplines, and logistical measures — contributes to a precarious but functional balance, in which the absence of catastrophic reverses becomes in itself a sign of success. The war along the Danube in this period is no longer an emergency conflict. It is an organized and intelligent resistance struggle, a demonstration of how the empire knows how to transform apparently insurmountable difficulties into the capacity for control and permanent pressure. The presence of Marcus Aurelius on the front line continues to give cohesion and authority, while the generals in the field, like Maximian, offer concrete examples of leadership, courage and adaptation, pushing operations up to Laugaricio and beyond the limes, as evidenced by rock inscriptions that tell of dedication, discipline and the ability to resist in extreme conditions. Over the course of the year, war shows its more realistic and less epic face compared to the triumphs that tradition tends to celebrate. The clashes, although numerous, are fragmented and exhausting, often without an immediate decisive outcome, but crucial to maintaining the balance of the front and preventing the enemy from concentrating its forces. Every action, every patrol, every garrison becomes a piece of the overall strategy. The outposts, fortified camps, controlled marches and patrols contribute to building a defensive and offensive system at the same time, which limits the freedom of movement of the enemies and forces the barbarian tribes to deal with the Roman ability to project power even far from their borders. In this widespread war, valor is not measured in great triumphs, but in the perseverance of the legions, in the ability of commanders to make quick decisions and in the holding of logistical and disciplinary lines. The winter of 179 to 180, with the feat of Maximian and his 855 men at Laugaricio, offers concrete evidence of this resilience. Going this far north of the limes, wintering in extreme conditions and leaving a tangible memory of your presence represents an extraordinary act of courage and organization. The episode embodies the essence of leadership on the field which, although far from the ceremony of triumphs, has a profound impact on the perception of war. It demonstrates that Roman commanders did not just act as executors of orders, but as agents capable of transforming strategic directives into tangible realities, operating with calculated autonomy and showing personal value and responsibility towards their men. This balance between central strategy and local initiative is one of the reasons why Rome manages to contain and wear down the enemy without giving up ground. At the same time, the army itself, in 179, reaches a degree of maturity and adaptation that allows it to support continuous and complex operations. Training, calibrated discipline, management of marches and camps, the targeted use of auxiliaries and veterans create a coherent system, capable of facing high risks without compromising the general stability. War therefore also becomes an exercise in organization and resilience. Every decision, from the choice to march towards Laugaricio to the defense of an outpost, is part of a network of relationships between men, territory and resources that requires constant attention and foresight. The effectiveness of the system is measured in the continuity of Roman pressure on the enemy, and in the ability to avoid disasters that could compromise months or years of effort. From a strategic point of view, 179 shows the logic of the War of Attrition and containment that characterized the empire during the Marcomannic Wars. It is not isolated episodes that determine the fate of the conflict, but the sum of repeated decisions, controlled marches, organized garrisons, and careful tactical choices. The Romans did not seek to annihilate the enemy in a single clash, but to limit his possibilities, progressively wear him down and demonstrate the empire's ability to project constant force. In this, the skill of the commanders in the field, the efficiency of the legions and the strategic vision of Marcus Aurelius combine to maintain a fragile but effective balance, which avoids collapse and prepares the ground for future phases of the conflict. The balance of the year, despite no spectacular victories, is positive. The army held firm, the Germanic tribes were subjected to continuous pressure, the outposts and fortified camps consolidated Roman control, and the offensive actions demonstrated the ability to operate even far from the borders. The commanders in the field, Maximian in the lead, confirmed that value and discipline are not just abstract ideals, but tangible realities, which allow Rome to maintain the front even in the most adverse conditions. The War of 179 did not leave monumental triumphs, but it left strategic order, operational control and concrete testimony to the courage and tenacity of Roman soldiers and generals. The year ends thus, with an unstable but functional balance, and with the awareness that the Marcomannic War is a long, tiring and complex ordeal, in which success is not measured only by the bloodshed in a single clash, but by the ability to withstand the pressure, to organize the army, to guide the commanders and to maintain the social and political cohesion of the empire. In this vision, 179 AD represents an emblematic year. The war did not offer immediate glory, but it demonstrated the resilience, discipline and value of the Romans, confirming that, even in the most difficult conditions, the empire can project its power, govern men and territories, and resist an enemy that has learned to move with cunning and speed. The memory of these operations, of the marches, of the camps and of the clashes, as well as of exploits such as that of Laugaricio, constitutes a lasting testimony of an army that knows how to transform difficulty into effectiveness, risk into discipline and daily resistance into a winning strategy. The War of 179, even without monumental triumphs, therefore embodies the discrete and concrete epic of the Roman legions, an ability to organize, support and project strength that remains imprinted both in the stones of the fortresses and in the minds of the soldiers and commanders who defended and guided them.